All right. Good morning and good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Risk Intelligence Developing an Intelligence Standard panel discussion. My name is Johanna Loke. I am the chair of the Risk Intelligence community here at ASIS. Joining me today, I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Angela Lewis, who is the vice chair of the Intelligence Standard Development. Susan Cariotti, the VP of Certifications, Standards, and Guidelines, and Ivelisse Opika, the ASIS Director of Standards and Guidelines. Today's event will be recorded and posted on the ASIS Community Library. Throughout this discussion, please do feel free to use the chat, and I will be monitoring the chat throughout, as well as trying to incorporate questions throughout as appropriate, as well as leaving room at the end to welcome questions directly. We'll be planning for about a 40-minute discussion, 45-minute discussion, followed by time for questions. Final housekeeping point here. Do please remember to keep microphones on mute. And the next event that the ASIS Risk Intelligence Community will be hosting is on June 30th, which will be a quarterly call which updates anyone who's interested in what the community is up to, upcoming events, research, and other initiatives that we're working on. I am going to jump right into this because there's so much to cover, and we have these amazing panelists to quiz on a really important issue. So, in the discussions about an intelligence standard, Sue, could you start with just what is a standard? What is ASIS's approach towards standards?
Sure, happy to. ASIS is a global standards development organization, SDO, accredited by the American National Standards Institute, ANSI. ASIS serves in two technical committees in the International Organization of Standardization, ISO, which some of you may be familiar with, in risk management and security and resilience. So in terms of what ANSI accreditation means, it means that an SDO such as ASIS has been formally recognized as operating in accordance with ANSI requirements for openness, balance, and due process. Specifically, it means about 5 key principles. Openness, meaning the process is open to any participation by any materially affected and interested party without undue restrictions. Balance, no single interest, whether it's a company, government agency, or trade group, can dominate the process. Diverse stakeholders, producers, users, consumers, government, academia must have the opportunity to participate. In terms of due process, participants have the right to be heard, to appeal decisions, and to expect that their comments, including objections, will be considered and responded to on their merits. In terms of consensus, this is the decision process where decisions are reached through consensus, meaning that substantial agreement among those materially affected, not necessarily unanimity. It means lack of opposition from a substantial portion of participants is also considered. And in terms of the last one, transparency, this means that the process and its outcomes are documented and publicly available. So ANSI accreditation, it also signals to the marketplace, regulators, and government agencies that the standard was developed rigorously and represents broad stakeholder agreement. ANSI itself does not write standards. It accredits organizations like ASIS and also other organizations such as SIA, NFPA, etc. These are the groups that do the actual standards writing and creation, not ANSI. And ASIS is a part of this process. We intentionally do extensive outreach to engage international stakeholders. So this is not, our standards are not US centric. And I want to make mention of something that many people probably don't know. Unlike in ISO, ANSI audits the entire process of how a standard is developed from initiation to publication. This happens every 5 to 6 years. This is to ensure quality, balance, and defensibility.
Thank you very much.
Of course.
And moving this towards the intelligence standard specifically, Angela, what do you see as what does an intelligence standard entail, I guess, especially with how many definitions and understandings of intelligence there are in the private sector?
Yeah. So when talking about an intelligence standard, we are trying to avoid coming off as a rigid checklist or a prescribed organizational model, because obviously we've seen intelligence teams and organizations and even the function of intelligence operates so differently across different organizations. So we're trying to talk about a shared framework of principles, processes, and expectations that helps an organization establish, evaluate, and improve its intelligence capabilities. So many professions have standards that define what good practice looks like. Intelligence has matured significantly as a profession, particularly in the private sector, but there's been relatively little consensus about what those foundational expectations are. So this standard is seeking to provide that common language and foundation while also recognizing that intelligence functions, as I said, vary significantly in size, mission, industry, maturity, et cetera. So the standard isn't telling every organization to do intelligence the same way. It's really helping the organization to understand what good intelligence might look like, and then they can implement it from there.
Perfect. Thank you. And where are we at in this intelligence standard? You know, we've started hearing about it on social media and that kind of thing, but what's the current status and perhaps some key milestones to look ahead for in this process? I'll turn this to Sue or Ivelisse.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that one. So currently, we have completed seating the technical committee. Prior to that, we have been working, had been working for several months actually with a smaller group of individuals that have really brought together at least a starting point document. And it's something that allows then the technical committee to look at, to really chew on, and to take from there in order to really evaluate the contents of the standard. And through these meetings, the future meetings and discussions, will determine collectively through the consensus process what ultimately will belong in the standard, what's in, what's out, what gets revised further, etc. So we really like when we start a project to have something established. It really makes the process of standards development go easier, and it also allows us to provide the volunteers, the most effective use of their time when they come to meet collectively to produce the content. Now, let me just take this opportunity then to just kind of go through the full life cycle of the standards development process, because I think that's an important piece. And I'm sure everyone would want to understand kind of not just where we are now, but where are we moving in the future here. So initially, the standards process begins, the whole process has essentially 8 steps. The first step really is that initial idea and that development stage where either it's a proposal, it's an idea, it can come from a practitioner in the community, it can come from a technical committee member, it can even come from a non-ASIS individual. So anyone can propose a standards project to be developed within ASIS. Once that proposal is submitted, we do have the ASIS Professional Standards Board. That is the board that adjudicates and has governance over the standards program. They review and determine whether or not a proposal gets accepted or gets rejected, or if they have to move forward in another fashion. Once a project is approved, then essentially that's the process at which we start the committee formation efforts. At the same time, we're also undergoing the preparatory phase of creating that initial content if no initial content exists already. In many cases, right, sometimes we're to a point that Sue made earlier, we have to revise our industry standards every 5 to 6 years. And so in those cases, then we actually have something already to chew on, right? The existing document that needs to be reviewed and revised. But absent of that, we're doing preparatory work to get something in place. And so then the technical committee undertakes a process where, they review, they submit comments, they meet together on a very frequent basis in order to really have these discussions about what it is, the important elements that belong in the standard, and where things can be improved, and where, they have to really perhaps focus some efforts into. So that's an iterative process. It's a process that requires a review of multiple levels of the document within the technical committee. And then there's a point at which, after the committees have really reviewed and talked through and really further develop the content of the standard, they get to a point where then there's agreement that the standard is going to be the best that it's going to be. And I say that because no industry standard is perfect. There's absolutely no such thing as a perfect standard, but you bring these experts together to essentially ensure that the best information is being provided. So in addition to that, then once the committee feels that it has been sufficiently developed, then it will go ahead and potentially then submit the document for letter balloting within the technical committee. At the same time, then we also have a public review process that is conducted. And that's really important because any individual that did not have the opportunity to participate on the technical committee gets the opportunity to review the document and submit their comments, perhaps that they wish to submit in order to improve upon the standard. So these processes are non-negotiables. These are really important elements of the standards process to ensure that both at the committee level and at the public level, there is agreement and consensus around what that industry standard needs to look like. And then following those pieces, then we go through that final approval process and publication. So all of these steps, that really are also part of the ANSI accreditation, they're steps that exist to protect the credibility of that final standard. And it ensures that standard, survives like legal scrutiny and regulatory and professional scrutiny from others in the industry.
Thank you, Ivelisse. That's really helpful to give a context here and an overall timeline. You touched on bringing in a large group of industry experts. Perhaps Sue, could you speak a little bit about the number of people involved, as well as what ASIS does to ensure that there is global representation and as diverse representation as possible, given how diverse intelligence is, both in terms of the fact that it is practiced everywhere, as well as across all different types of industries, and that can look different?
Sure, I'll start this and Ivelisse can piggyback on me here. So essentially those involved in the standards creation, it's those that are interested in developing the standard, those materially affected parties. So ASIS utilizes 3 membership categories when it forms its technical committees, and our technical committees are maxed at 50 people. But the 3 interest categories, they start with general interest, and this is government, non-for-profit, academia, and other interested parties. We also have producer service provider, which comprises consultants, service firms, and other equipment manufacturers and suppliers. And lastly, user manager category, which is about supervisors or persons in charge of day-to-day security management, operations, or systems. And certainly what we really wanted to highlight also here is we also open the door to non-ASIS members. So ANSI requires that we can't just say it can only be ASIS members developing the standard. So in terms of inclusivity, we do want to max participation to the extent we can, but it can be a bit challenging when you're dealing with a committee level of 50 people and there's so many interested parties, especially in a standard like this one. So maybe I'll just leave it there and see, Ivelisse, do you have anything else you want to add?
Yeah, definitely. So I think first I want to start with just mentioning that, having a diverse representation on a technical committee is not by any means aspirational. No, it is a key requirement of the standards development process. And Sue mentioned the different interest categories that we always seek to have on our project. And that's an important element that is mandated through our accreditation through ANSI. So, we have to ensure that technical committees represent a balance of interests. It means that there needs to be an active and structured outreach process to ensure that those that, as she said, are materially interested have that opportunity to engage and to be a part of these committees to the extent possible. Now, in the case of the Intel Standards Project, we do procedurally have a max of 50 voting members, and we are at capacity. So we did receive a tremendous amount of interest for this project, and the level of expertise of those individuals that are participating is beyond stellar, and we super appreciate the interest that this project did receive. So as far as the that representation as well as concern, I think one key thing is the for this project especially is the international participation specifically because ASIS as an ISO Category A liaison. We have relationships across the globe and we have members across the globe. And it is really also important to ensure that we're seeking those non-US and those global members to participate in these projects. And I think that's a really distinguishing feature that ASIS has compared to many other national standards bodies. We are one of the few bodies that participate not just nationally, but internationally as well through ISO. And so that allows our membership not just to participate in something that could have U.S. interest, but rather, on the contrary, it also has global application and global interest as well. And that's really important.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you. And are you able to speak at all to the spread of, like, for example, locations or anything like that of the current technical committee?
So off the top of my head, I can't remember all the details, but and maybe Angie might remember some of that. But we have individuals from practically every continent seated on this technical committee. So we have a really good representation that includes, global participants as well as non-ASIS members. And again, that is a really important element of our standards. We strive and aim with every project to ensure that global interests are represented on the technical committee, being an international association.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I can't remember the exact countries, but I know that we were very much paying attention to where people were located. And not just where they were located, but also where they kind of serve, like what businesses and where their businesses are located. So we could have that, multinational focus. And so that it wasn't, just a US centric standard or, because we do like to dominate. And so that is not always the best when you're looking for an international standard.
Absolutely. And it occurred to me that I believe there are four members on the Risk Intelligence Steering Committee who are technical committee members, including myself. And of those four, we're in three different continents. So we have that's kind of a good display right there. Diving more into the intelligence aspect of this standard, which is obviously the focus of this call. Angela, could you speak a little bit more about, obviously there's even the term intelligence, there's disagreement about, what intelligence is. So is there something you're able to share on this call about a basic scope or outline or, what is trying to be achieved with this standard?
Yeah, of course. You're absolutely right. I mean, obviously, intelligence doesn't have a standard definition across, organizations and even within the government. I mean, it's a difficult thing to fully define because a lot of people, take different tasks or responsibilities that often fall under intelligence that may not technically be an intelligence function. And so we tried to keep this obviously rather broad, as is the nature of standards in general. The committee is obviously still developing the final content, but we did spend a lot of time trying to scope it effectively and to define what we're talking about when we're talking about intelligence. And so one of the things that I'm really focused on in particular with intelligence is that it has to be a decision support function. Obviously a lot of organizations, particularly in governments, think of secrecy and things like that, which obviously don't apply here. So we were really looking at speaking to sort of governance, intelligence requirements, collection management. We did use the Intel cycle as a framework, although as most people in intelligence know, the Intel cycle itself is, under a lot of scrutiny. A lot of people say it's, not fit for purpose. We use it as a framework. So it gave us some general topics that we wanted to address, not necessarily as a holistic, here is how intelligence should or, should be done, but more of these are the different aspects of intelligence that we want to make sure we are touching on. So again, it includes governance, intelligence requirements, collection management, analysis, which is obviously a big one, dissemination, stakeholder engagement, feedback mechanisms, ethics, and obviously continuous improvement. And we're not just focused on intelligence products, which is another place where a lot of people sort of think of intelligence, they think of the product. We're looking at intelligence, again, as an organizational capability that is supporting decision making. So that means considering not just the analytic activities, but also the structures and the processes and the relationships that kind of get folded into intelligence. And that makes it a little bit broader than, the individual definition of intelligence itself, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And taking a step further for someone who is unsure about how they feel about this creation of an intelligence standard or a standard in general, perhaps also to give you a break, Angie, rather than just, every question towards you now about intelligence, Sue or Ivelisse, could you make the pitch of why do we need standards? What is the purpose of a standard? And then Angela, maybe if you could jump in after them in terms of what you envision as the purpose, the dream for this intelligence standard.
That's a good question. Let's think back. What is a standard actually? It is an agreed upon way of doing something. So standards are certainly developed to address a market need. That's sort of the crux of getting them going. But I'm going to turn it over to Ivelisse to see what she might want to add on top of that.
Yeah, it's really interesting because standards, I think we tend to forget that standards sometimes blindly are in every single facet of our lives. Everything that we do every single day of our lives includes some kind of standard that allowed for that thing to be there, to function the way that it functions. And so the importance of, I think, standards just cannot be overstated. Standards are there to protect people. They're there to protect processes, to help organizations thrive, to ensure that there's consistencies in how programs are developed, how they're operated. They provide, also help provide a level playing field. They help increase professionalism in the fields. I mean, there's so many reasons why standards are so important. ASIS is making a continuous, efforts to constantly update and, produce more standards that will really, really help the field and the industry thrive and perform its jobs better and faster in some cases.
Yeah, I mean, I think in addition to the purpose of the standard itself and sort of the pitch for it, I think the timing is also particularly important. Because organizations are obviously operating in increasingly complex environments characterized by global instability, technological disruption, regulatory changes, supply chain vulnerabilities, and there's just this rapidly evolving threat landscape. And so at the same time, intelligence functions are becoming more common across the industries, but I guess they've often developed independendly and, sort of with unique capabilities and expectations and things like that. So as a result, we're seeing a lot of variation in the terminology and the governance structures and the methodologies and the maturity. And so I think the standard is there to help provide that professional foundation that helps organizations to build intelligence capabilities that are effective and ethical and defensible and aligned with decision making, but also to demonstrate their value, right? I think a lot of intelligence functions struggle to get buy-in or to get resources or things like that. And a standard can help to sort of identify that value and demonstrate, how it can be used across an organization. So being able to kind of help provide that foundation, it helps leaders to sort of understand what they should, reasonably expect from an intelligence function, and it can provide practitioners with that sort of a benchmark against which they can assess and improve their program. And so we're kind of going into the academia side of things. There's professionalization literature that generally describes, how professions are developing through gradual sort of institutionalization of, shared knowledge and standards and competencies and, ethics and all of those different pieces. And, being able to see standard as a function within that process, it kind of it has those agreed upon principles that Sue and Ivelisse commented on, the practices, the common language for practitioners, the baseline against which performance and capability is evaluated. And as professions mature, standards often become linked to, broader professional infrastructure. So training curriculums and certification programs and competency frameworks and accreditations and things like that. So, and continuing education requirements too. So when you think about it from that perspective, the development of an intelligence standard represents some of that maturity that we kind of need. But it's also not just guidance. It's a contribution to that ongoing maturation and professionalization of the field as a whole and as a discipline too. And I think it helps to build that foundation for the future as well. So I think it's important to note that professions are not professional because they have certifications or even because they have standards. They have certifications because they've first developed a sufficiently mature body of knowledge and standards of practice and shared understanding of what good looks like. So this is just kind of one step in that process, but it's a very, very important step.
Thank you all. When developing a standard, and again, I'll kind of start with Sue and Ivelisse here to give a broader your experience overall with standards, and then Angela with intelligence specifically. What do you find are the greatest challenges when creating a standard, especially once you've reached the stage? There is agreement that it should exist. The first steps have started. From here, what do you find are the greatest challenges, the most common challenges for standard development?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that first here. So I think in general, the most challenging aspect is building consensus, right? So everyone does things slightly different. The overarching concepts across the board might be the same, but how individuals and how companies approach them can be very different. Finding then the common language that can satisfy all of those different, the complexities of that, and the different perspectives is often extremely difficult. But one key thing that is really important in this process is that we make a concerted effort to ensure that all views are being addressed. So we do not approach this from the perspective of there has to be 100% agreement, because that's not what consensus is. Consensus is ensuring that there is, it does not mean unanimity, but it does mean that all of the views have been addressed, and we've had discussions about the areas that are challenging to come to consensus with. It means that we're going to really have in deep conversations sometimes about what should and shouldn't be in the standard. And ultimately, we always say as part of the standards process that it's not a process. There's no standard that's perfect. It's about what can you live with, and how are we utilizing that document to improve the industry, right? So standards are all about continuous improvement. You do the best that you can with those resources, those practitioners that are in the field, create that content, come to consensus as much as possible, and then execute upon that, publish it, allow that to be utilized in the field, and then come back with the learning experiences that organizations and individuals have had in implementing the standard so that we can continuously improve upon them. So I think that challenge reflects deeply as you have different people from different countries, and different cultures really impact also how standards are viewed and how they're implemented. And so our key processes involve making sure that we allow all individuals to present their perspectives, challenge one another, and really have some whatever dialogues are necessary to truly come to the level of agreement that they can all live with.
Thank you. I'm going to pivot this because of that answer. I'm going to pivot this question slightly for you, Angela, in that it kind of reminded me of how intelligence practitioners work in general. Consensus isn't what necessarily we're striving for, but oftentimes if there's competing analyses of a situation, that actually makes it a stronger product. So I guess to pivot my question in terms of challenges, I'll ask, what are some of the most lively debates that you are expecting out of this next process?
Yeah. Well, as I've noted, I mean, it's inherently a collaborative process, right? And I think intelligence is, we've jokingly said on a number of occasions that intelligence is a team sport, right? Um, so being able to have those different perspectives, I think, is really important. I think healthy debate is obviously going to be part of the process, and I think that's important. Some of the most interesting discussions will likely center on scope and terminology, and the level of specificity. I mean, even in here, it's sort of been like, well, what do we mean when we're talking about intelligence? And it's like, we're trying to be broad enough to encompass a large industry or kind of profession, if you will, that doesn't necessarily want to be defined easily. So I think, scope and terminology and the level of specificity that the standard should provide. We don't want to be prescriptive, but we do want to provide something that is useful for organizations. So how do you find that important kind of middle ground? How much should a standard describe versus prescribe? Those kinds of things. Minimum expectations, versus allowing organizational flexibility with their implementation. Things like that. I also think there's probably going to be some thoughtful discussions around the role of existing government intelligence standards and frameworks. The public sector has a much longer history of formalized intelligence doctrine, tradecraft standards, and governance mechanisms. And so there's a lot that we can learn from that experience. At the same time, the standards being developed for a global private sector community, not for any single country's intelligence service. So private sector intelligence functions operate in very different legal, regulatory, organization, and operational environments. And many practitioners are responsible for a much broader range of activities than their public sector counterparts. So I think while government intelligence organizations often specialize by discipline or phase of maybe the intelligence process, a single analyst or a small team in a private sector organization might be responsible for requirements management and collection and analysis and dissemination and stakeholder engagement and feedback. So as a result, one important discussion is probably going to be on determining what concepts are sufficiently sort of universal to incorporate from some of those other documents, while ensuring that the standard remains fit for purpose for private sector organizations, rather than simply sort of doing a lift and shift of any one government standards. We're also operating during a period of significant technological change. So, with AI and advanced analytics and things like that, so determining which of those concepts are sufficiently mature and enduring to include in a long-term standard will be an important discussion as well. But those debates, again, are valuable, right? They help to ensure that the final product reflects diverse perspectives and is stronger as a result, and is also able to stand the test of time as well. So honestly, if there aren't debates, we're probably not asking the right questions.
Absolutely. And diving into, I'm going to take a audience question here. And just as a reminder to all of our audience members, do feel free to use the chat to ask questions throughout. We will leave time at the end. But if you have a question that it seems like this would be a good time in the discussion, please do feel free. And in this case, I'm going to read out a question here from Gary Wilson, which was, what consideration will be given to shifting intelligence supporting decisions making to being a driver of actions and operations? When operations and actions must adapt to highly fluid, asymmetrical environments, intelligence absolutely can and must at times drive actions directly. So, Angela, I'm going to put this one to you.
I mean, so when I look at this question, I think of the question of tactical versus strategic, and I kind of think of, I think there is a push and for a lot of organizations to show their value, intelligence organizations to show their value through, the strategic decision support mechanism. But, they can't leave behind the tactical support, the technical collection, and how that affects the day-to-day operations, right? So it's a hybrid thing. When we're looking at the standard, we're looking at both, right? We're looking at both the tactical and the strategic. So because both functions are represented across an intelligence function. So we can't have one dominating the other. And I think that's been one of the enduring challenges that a lot of organizations face is, when you go hard on focusing on the day-to-day, the tactical, the urgent needs, those kinds of requirements, it often clouds out the strategic, and it makes it very difficult to maintain a strategic focus because, the tyranny of the urgent. Now, so I think that prioritization is a really, really important aspect of that, and understanding how to carve out the space for those strategic interests, because strategic interests can become tactical and urgent very quickly if they're not addressed over the long term. So trying to find a way to balance them both and to make sure that that is in the standard, I think will also be an important piece.
Kind of a follow-up from that, is there also an element of maturity levels within the standard, just in terms, especially in terms of being like reactive versus proactive for an intelligence program?
So one of the things that we talked about with this was sort of the aspect that we want this to be something where somebody could take this and say, here's how I would develop an intelligence function. So that's kind of starting from ground zero, right? But at the same time, we want to be able to provide enough guidance that says, here's what good looks like, right? And that's going to be different by organization. So, what the expectations are, what the risk profile is, what, the footprint is for any organization is going to be different. And what a leader is expecting is going to be different. That even depends on their exposure to intelligence and its capabilities as well. So I would say we want to try to make it as useful for as broad a group as possible. I know I've kind of tried my hand in developing maturity matrix to sort of say, here's what this would look like in different areas. I don't know if we're going to include something like that in the standard, because we don't want to be too prescriptive, and we don't want to put people in a box either. But that's kind of the idea, is we want something that is both useful for here's how you might get started, and also shows the iterative nature of how you would continue developing and growing to, better and better levels, or more and more capabilities, or, broadening that. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there's so many challenges in terms of the range of organizations who might be using this standard in terms of capabilities, size, and everything else. Angela, last question for you before I give you a break here. I'm going to incorporate one more audience question before I switch over to Ivelisse or Sue again. And I'm going to expand on it a little bit here. So we have the question, how will you address physical security, information security, and cybersecurity for IT and OT systems? I'd like to expand that even a little bit further, in that, you touched on the fact that intelligence functions at different organizations encompass widely different duties. So, there are certainly some organizations that I know where there's a huge gray area between investigations and intelligence, others where there is much more of a social media monitoring and reputational, which mixed with the kind of marketing team. There's just so many different organizations of how intelligence systems work. What is the thinking around that for an intelligence standard, just like where the remit ends, basically?
So we spent a lot of time scoping, early on, and trying to discuss, like, are we speaking for cyber threat intelligence? Are we speaking for, all these other entities, or are we just speaking for physical security intelligence? And I think at the end of the day, we did try to include a lot of sort of the geopolitical focus within security, because intelligence has such a long history in both intelligence and in geopolitics, right? So there is a natural sort of, synergy, if you will, between those two. And so we tried to kind of keep that. But a lot of those other elements, like cyber, have similar, concepts and issues that can be brought in and that can be addressed, while we don't necessarily want to speak for them. So the industry, are we talking about just physical security? Because I see that question there too. Yes, but also we're trying to keep it broad enough to where the principles can be applied a little bit more, because if you're looking at it as a decision support mechanism, that can be useful across different domains. So I think that's, yes, we spent a lot of time scoping it and trying to keep it within sort of more of a physical and geopolitical security element. But because we're looking at broad principles, that doesn't mean that it's only useful in those domains, if that makes sense. And Ivelisse and Sue, feel free to jump in on this.
Got it.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to ask a question and then kind of lead it to Jonathan Cooper's question here, which was going to be directed to Sue and Ivelisse, which is once a standard is created and published, what are the next steps? How does a new standard get understood? How does it get adopted? And to the question in the chat here, how is it enforced? And if it is enforced, and who will it be applied to?
Sure, I'd be happy to take this one. So, of course, generating awareness and engagement is essential, but and I'll talk about some of the ways. One of the most common ways is voluntary adoption. So companies, professionals, or organizations choose to follow a standard because it signals quality, enables interoperability, simplifies procurement, or satisfies customers' expectation. So no one's forcing them, it's just making business sense. So many widely used standards, such as the ISO 9001, for example, in quality management, are utilized this way. Another way, as is mentioned in the chat to what you were talking about, is the regulatory environment. So regulatory incorporation. So a government agency references or adopts a standard in a regulation, making compliance mandatory. And this is extremely common, especially in the US. Agencies like OSHA, for example, that routinely incorporate standards by reference rather than writing their own technical requirements. So once this happens, then the standard effectively becomes law within that regulatory domain. Another way is contractual requirements. So a buyer, government or private, requires suppliers to meet a standard as a condition of doing business. So federal procurement rules often mandate specific standards. Large private companies do the same in their supply chains. But ultimately, the marketplace will determine the uptick. A key insight that I wanted to mention here is that the publication is really just the beginning. A standard's real influence depends on who is using it, who is requiring it, and whether the infrastructure, training, or certification, certificate programs exist to make compliance practical. And certainly with the Intel standard, ASIS will be looking at learning offerings after it is published. For example, a certificate program that will probably be developed and other things too. Ivelisse, do you want to add anything on here?
No, that was absolutely perfect. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I just want to touch on, there was a second half of Jonathan Cooper's comment, and I don't want it to be lost. So I just want to touch on that, which was kind of and touch on another comment earlier in the chat. Could you speak a little bit about the difference between kind of a best practice guidance versus a standard, and clarifying where we are with this?
Yeah, I can jump in on that one. So let's look at standards. Standards and guidelines are different in that standards really aim at providing what is the absolute best practice in the industry. The guidance documents will provide more of the how-to mechanism. So more of what are some of the good things that can support then those best practices? How can you then implement, for example, the requirements of a standard that outlines industry best practices? Now, I say that, however, across the globe, we have found that different standards bodies around the globe have different definitions for standards and guidelines. And in the case of ISO, for example, ISO calls everything a standard, whether it's just a guidance document or not. And so I think at the heart of it, what is important to understand is that standards, and specifically through the ANSI process, a standard is something that has credibility around it. It's really been developed to really bring forth the best practice using the expertise of industry, and it really is developing something that will really help improve the whatever that is, that standards topic out there, whether it's improving workplace violence prevention programs, whether it's improving physical security or information security. It is providing a common language that organizations can use across the board. And guidelines are there to support industry standards. But I do think here, ASIS is moving more towards creating a more robust library of industry standards, high-level standards that really give flexibility to organizations as to how they want to implement it, and not prescribing specific guidance on how that should be done.
Thank you. I really appreciate that information. I want to loop back slightly to something you mentioned earlier, Angela, which was the timing of the standard. Specifically, I wonder, once the standard is developed, uh, I'd love to hear a little bit more about how it's maintained, how it's updated, and you touched on the fact earlier about the fact that this is focusing more on the physical security, but with how much AI enabled threats there are, and the changing landscape of the risks that that implies, and the rapidity, how quickly risks are evolving there. Could you touch a little bit on how standards are updated, how they are maintained? Perhaps first starting with you, Sue and Ivelisse, in general, how are standards updated? And then Angela, specifically, how the intelligence standard reckons with this.
Yeah, I can take that. So standards are not a permanent document, right? They're not something that we want developed and have sit on someone's shelf. Essentially, industry standards are required to be reviewed every several years. I think Sue even mentioned, so every 5 to 6 years or so, there is an effort to ensure that we are reviewing that standards content and, as applicable, updating it. I will say that there are rare cases where perhaps a technical committee can decide that it still is quite applicable and there aren't any changes, but that is a rare occurrence. In most cases, standards are updated at least every 5 years. Now, that said, I think one of the key things, and something that you mentioned, Joanna, is that a lot of standards are really trying to understand what is the role of AI, and this is no different. I know there's a lot of discussions out there, and we kind of approach this as it's a tool, just like so many other things out there that industry professionals are going to use as a tool. That said, as things as technology and processes and things of that nature change, there may be an opportunity or a need to revise our industry standards before the 5-year mark. And so ASIS is most certainly open to that. And it's really going to be dictated by folks like you all and the industry, and how quickly these things mature in the marketplace.
Yeah, and sort of applying that to intelligence. I mean, intelligence is obviously evolving very quickly because it is so directly impacted by so much that's happening, in the world today, and these developments. And so I would say that, how are we going to continually update this? Well, number one, we're trying to create a standard that is enduring and that is something that can stand the test of time, that is broad enough that all of these technological changes and these developments can still fit within the framework. That's ideally how good frameworks, kind of last the test of time. But again, if there is something that maybe has not been addressed and needs to be, or doesn't really neatly fit into one of these categories, then obviously, we can look at doing an update to it as well. But I think that's the goal, is to create something that is broad enough that, when changes happen, that we're able to kind of, it flexes with it and is able to kind of include that as well.
Thank you. And we are at the kind of 10-minute mark, so I'm going to be focusing really on questions from audience. I'll be taking questions which are in the chat, but if you would rather ask the question directly, do feel free to raise your hand, and I'm happy to call on questions that way as well. So I'll start with a question here from Maria Fontanilla. And it is about what would the standard include the relationship or interaction between the private sector and public sector agencies as part of the corporate security management measures based on intelligence? How would this factor be addressed? And I'm also going to kind of throw in here, just given the fact that different countries, the relationship between the private and public sector are so different from one another, with some being, I've seen some countries where the private sector actually feeds the public sector because the resources are more advanced. Some where it's very collaborative, some where it is intentionally not collaborative, and they are kept very, very separate. So, what are your thoughts on interactions between public and private sector and their place in the standard?
So I can jump in on this a little bit. We did have a pretty robust conversation about this very topic in one of our initial calls. Just the nature of you know different different countries, different nationalities seeing intelligence from a very different perspective, both in public and private sector, and their approaches being so different. We have addressed things like information security, not in the like technical aspect, but in the how are you maintaining your information and how are you able to share back and forth effectively, especially in environments that require a little bit more secrecy or caution. So we have addressed something like that. This is also part of a bigger picture question that is really stakeholders and relationship management, right? So you're looking at the nature of different relationships, and that some of that can be sourcing and collection. So those are aspects that have been discussed in it. So maybe it's not directly, oh, this is how you should be interacting with the public sector, but this is how you should be interacting with potential sources of information and who may have different requirements, different regulations, different relationships with data. So that I think is a bigger picture focus, and the way that we approached it was not just, hey, here is the how you would have a relationship with the public sector entity, but more, here's how you would interact with outside entities from your organizations that are outside of your own that you might need to collaborate with.
Great, thank you. I'm seeing some questions about, when there are disagreements or things like that. I know it was mentioned earlier on the call that it doesn't have to have consensus. So I'm going to use an example here just to see how that would play out. And the example that comes to mind is the use of sock puppets. Ethics has come up a few times here. Now, most discussions I see academically or otherwise say that offensive intelligence is a pretty solid no across most organizations, to say the least. However, the use of any deception, for example, the use of a sock puppet if you're gathering intelligence, so an account that is a persona account that is not in your name. If it was really divisive amongst the discussion of the technical committee, is the go-to to just make a call to just state that there is a lot of disagreement and say what the most basic common statement is, such as no offensive? Or how is a really disputed topic handled in the technical committee?
Yeah, let me address that one really quick. So, Joanna, one of the things to clarify, actually, the standards development process is one that does seek consensus, right? However, consensus does not mean unanimity across the board, right? So that's a really important element because, as with every standards project, there will be some hard discussions, some disagreements. And the key there is that everyone is afforded the opportunity to really present their position, why they feel a certain way, why they're inclined to perhaps, disagree with their colleagues in the field. And the idea is that there is this continual opportunity to discuss these things and, bring them slightly closer to reaching that consensus. So we often tell folks, and I mentioned this before, that standards are not perfect. They're not going to be written perfectly for every single application, for every single country and every organization. That doesn't exist. But the key is that we address the concepts at a high level, that they can agree on that. How they want to then implement that and execute upon it really is up to each individual and each organization. And so that's something that we don't necessarily then have to have too many challenges around, right? Because we maintain these concepts at such a high level that they're generally they generally don't have real significant disagreement. Oftentimes, our standards projects will find disagreements on wordsmithing, but not necessarily the higher concepts. And so we want to make sure, though, that we're focusing on those important elements, because at the end of the day, that's really what's going to drive, the ultimate acceptance of this document. Anything, Angie or Sue, want to add?
I would just add that, the sock puppet example is, I think, a really, really good one. And, the way that I would interpret that through kind of the draft standard that we kind of have out there right now is, you know, it has to align with your country and your organization's legal and regulatory requirements. And so we've kind of, we're not creating a standard that exists outside of the context that people are operating in. So it has to bring in elements like that. So if, your organization operates in a manner that using sock puppets and, doing offensive is somehow part of your, remit. We don't want to say you can't do your job. That said, it is something that would have to fall in line with, legal frameworks from something like that. So that's sort of how we've towed the line on that, is to try not to be prescriptive and say, this is from an ethics standpoint, this is right or wrong, but more, this is how your organization perceives it, and you need to align with that.
Absolutely. I appreciate that answer and that information. We're coming up to about a 3 minute, 4 minute mark here. So we've answered almost all the questions. If I haven't gotten to your question in the chat, I apologize. I'd like to end with a question that helps our audience in terms of next steps. And I know that the public comment phase has been referenced earlier in the discussion, but going a little more specifically and outside of that as well, how can practitioners and stakeholders participate who are not currently on the technical committee? What does the public comment phase look like, and are there any other points or things to be looking out for, and for those who would like to be more involved with this in now or in the future?
Yeah, so I'll jump in on that one. So, unfortunately, we don't have a specific time frame right now as to when the document will be available for public review. That information, though, when it becomes available, we will be posting that on the Standards and Guidelines webpage, ASIS's webpage. And what I will say, one of the most important things that anyone right now can do is visit that webpage. And towards the bottom, under the Standards Under Development section, you're going to find information about this specific project. In particular, there's also a link where you can sign up to receive that information rather than having to come, on a frequent basis to the website to see if the document is available. Now, when the standard does become available for public review, it will be a 45-day public review process. So it hopefully provides all individuals the ability to review the content, and should they have comments, can submit that for the technical committee's consideration. And so as part of that public review process, please know that every single comment, whether it's at the technical committee level or through public review, the technical committee will be adjudicating every single one of those comments, and each individual will be informed of the disposition of said comments so that they can understand what to expect in terms of the standards content and whether or not their comments were incorporated, and if so, how did the committee do that? So those are, again, important processes, part of the standards overall framework. And so we're hoping that in closer to the end of the year, we'll have something for the public to view. But in the meantime, anyone can always send us an email in the coming months and always ask for an update, and we'll be more than happy to provide that.
Yep, and I can definitely confirm that the risk intelligence community will make sure to post in our community chats and everywhere else as soon as the public comment phase opens up. Well, similarly, we'll post on our LinkedIn and such. So if you're not part of those communities, please do join, because we're going to try to share as much of this as possible. All right, well, that brings us to the full hour. Angela, Ivelisse, Sue, I cannot thank you enough for bringing your expertise and knowledge to this panel. And thank you to everyone who joined us. Like I said, I will be sharing this recording onto our community, and really appreciate everyone's participation and the lively discussions and questions we had. So thank you very much. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.